Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So last week we heard that the Keystone XL pipeline was being canceled after a 13-year saga during which it became a major focal point of climate activists, got blocked twice by Barack Obama, and then revived by Donald Trump. It was blocked again by Joe Biden on his first day in office in January. So with no options left, the company, TC Energy Corp, finally shut down the project that was supposed to run from Alberta to Nebraska and give Alberta's oil companies access to refineries in the US. This is another big blow for Alberta, which is struggling to figure out how to transition out of a largely oil-based economy into a greener one. But the province is making moves. On June 9th, we heard Air Products and Chemicals announce that they're planning to build a $1.3 billion plant in Edmonton to produce hydrogen derived from natural gas. Alberta's placing a big bet on hydrogen as a fuel source, and Premier Jason Kenney says hydrogen will be crucial to the province's economic future.
Hydrogen can bring billions of dollars to Alberta's economy each year while cutting emissions and creating jobs, making it a real game changer.
In fact, the federal government is making a similar bet on hydrogen, both as an economic opportunity, but also as the quickest way to get to net zero emissions by 2050. The federal strategy from last year said we could be one of the world's top 3 hydrogen producers. And since some countries in Europe are also investing billions in their own energy transition, some of that cash could go to buying Canadian hydrogen. But not all hydrogen is created equal, and some experts worry that Canada's plan focuses too much on the kind that's made with fossil fuels.
We've got grey hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and green hydrogen. And I know it sounds like you're talking about a really dirty, weird-looking rainbow, but it does have some impact here and some implications for what a hydrogen market could potentially look like.
That's Emma Graney, the Globe's energy reporter.
G'day, how's it going?
She's been watching the hype around hydrogen, and she's here to tell us why it's having a moment and what Canada needs to do to seize the opportunity. That's today on The Decibel. Hydrogen is an element, the most abundant one in the universe. And it can be put in a fuel cell, kind of like a battery that, when you add air to it, releases electricity, water, and heat. No carbon emissions, no smoke, no tailpipe fumes. But hydrogen doesn't usually exist alone. You'll often hear the word hydrogen along with a color: gray, blue, or green. And that's a reference to how the hydrogen is made.
You've got grey hydrogen, which is you just kind of get natural gas or methane, then you crack it into hydrogen and carbon, and then you just let the carbon waft off into the atmosphere. It may strike you that that is not the most tempting option for countries that are trying to set net zero goals. So then you look at blue hydrogen, which is kind of the same thing. You crack up natural gas, except then you're capturing the carbon. So people have more stomach for that because you are capturing some of the emissions. And then you've got green hydrogen, which is the one that, in particular, environmentalists are extremely excited about because you're taking water, basically, and you're using electrolyzers to crack it into oxygen and hydrogen. So you don't have that carbon emissions part of it. And so you're just basically creating this extremely green fuel that doesn't burn emissions at the end of it. And I know it sounds like you're talking about a really dirty, weird-looking rainbow, but it does have some impact here and some implications for what a hydrogen market could potentially look like.
Yeah. Why do the proponents of hydrogen like it versus something like solar or other kinds of renewable energy?
Basically because of the fact it just doesn't emit emissions when you burn it. Now, that's the really key point here because you do have a lot of emissions when you're making hydrogen, and that's why the idea of green hydrogen is so attractive because you're not having as many emissions. So as governments around the world make these goals to hit net zero by 2050, that's where hydrogen has become a real kind of potential darling of an opportunity because they look at it and go, well, if we want to be net zero and if we're not burning as much, we don't have as many emissions when we're burning this fuel, then that's where it becomes the opportunity.
So hydrogen is hyped as this way of helping us reach our carbon emissions goals faster. But we've heard about the potential of hydrogen as the clean energy source of the future for decades, and people have been saying it's around the corner for a really long time. And I was just wondering if you could give us a brief history of how this conversation around hydrogen has evolved and how it's gotten to the point where it's at today.
It really does all come back to this real intense focus on net zero goals, because it's within that conversation that hydrogen has become the opportunity. So you're right, like decades ago, hydrogen started being used in engines. It's been used as jet fuel. And so people and you're right, they'd look at hydrogen and go like, oh yeah, hydrogen's so hot right now. And a lot of people who really did think it was going to be the big new thing, they got burned pretty badly like 20, 30 years ago when they were making investments with this conversation of, oh, it's going to be the next big thing. It's going to be awesome. It's going to make a ton of money for everybody. And it just didn't, because it is more expensive and there wasn't as much of a focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions as there are now globally, right? So that's where those things have it's this, I don't like the word confluence, but I think it is a perfect word to use at this point, because there is that real meeting of the minds around emissions reductions and then lowering the cost of the technology, because of course that's dropping significantly, and the net zero conversation.
So you mentioned that green hydrogen is expensive. So can you talk a little bit about why that is and what the challenge is?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's basically because the technology is newer, right? When it comes down to it, I mean, the world's been using hydrogen, just using hydrogen, producing hydrogen, using it for decades and decades and decades. But the technology of using electrolyzers to make hydrogen out of water is not as far along. It's also, you need bigger projects to do it. And so it is just more expensive, but it is falling significantly. It was a 2018 report by the International Energy Agency. It put the cost of hydrogen production around $7.50 a kilogram. So that's for green hydrogen, compared with $3 from natural gas. So that's your blue hydrogen. Now, since then, it's actually dropped even more to about $6 a kilogram for green hydrogen. And that's only in the past 2 or 3 years, right? We saw the same with solar energy. I mean, it used to be really quite expensive. But nowadays, it's fallen so significantly, even over the last 5-10 years. And the idea is, well, that can happen with hydrogen if we have enough of a focus on it and we have enough people, companies, governments willing to make the investments that really do spur research and development and make it a more viable fuel option, economically speaking.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of the ways that hydrogen is being used right now, but what are all of its potential uses? How are people hoping hydrogen fuel can actually be used?
It's funny. It's really, really broad use of hydrogen, but the biggest opportunity that seems to be being identified by national governments, and that's Canada, that's in different places in the EU, is transport. So long-haul transport. We're talking trucks, for instance, rail, potentially shipping as well. Shell has just had a hydrogen-powered ship. But you can also use it in other ways as well. So, for example, you can blend it in with natural gas to heat homes. There's a pilot project out here just outside of Edmonton, a place called Fort Saskatchewan, where they're trialing that right now.
What about cars? Can we use it to fuel cars?
Oh, sure. Why not? No, you can. It's just, it's not seen as much of a solution as, for example, electric vehicles. Potentially that might change, and there are some companies looking at hydrogen-powered vehicles, but it's generally those long-haul transports where we see there is most focus on hydrogen as having potential. And that's as well by virtue of the fact that if you want to have a whole bunch of hydrogen-powered vehicles, you need to put in hydrogen fueling stations, and that takes an awful lot of infrastructure, a lot of investment, and it takes governments working together. Both, for example, in Canada, if you wanted to do that, you'd have to have the federal government being like, okay, we're going to build hydrogen fueling stations, which they might do. I mean, the government's had a real focus on building a ton of electric vehicle charging stations, but it does mean you're making a choice, right?
So when I think of hydrogen, the thing that comes up for me is the Hindenburg, the hydrogen-fueled blimp that exploded, and the hydrogen bomb. I feel like these are associations that some people might make. So is it safe to use hydrogen? Do we know that it's safe?
It's a lot safer now. And you're exactly right. I mean, that's part of the conversation. You're not just trying to sell solar power or wind power to consumers here, like ultimately to end users. You're also having to go against this narrative of, oh, but a blimp exploded. Oh, there was this bomb. That doesn't, it didn't give hydrogen the best street cred, really, did it? But yes, it's a lot safer now. There have been a lot of leaps and bounds in safety. But part of that, you make a really good point, because out here, for instance, in Alberta, where they're doing this trial to blend hydrogen and natural gas, part of the problem for them is convincing consumers that we're not going to blow up your home if we do this. And you know what? It's a concern that the local council brought before the power company. And we're like, yeah, but hydrogen blows up, right? And you kind of have to, it's this extra layer of communications that governments are pretty aware of, and they've been really trying to make the case that it is safe now.
Yeah. So this all seems really obvious and makes sense to me, but there are some people who are still kind of reluctant to focus on hydrogen and put all their bets on hydrogen. Elon Musk, for example, has called hydrogen fuel cell technology, quote, mind-bogglingly stupid. Why does he say that? Why is it mind-bogglingly stupid?
We could have lots of conversations about things that Elon Musk has said, couldn't we? The idea is some people do dismiss it because they look at hydrogen and go, oh, yeah, well, you said it was going to be so hot right now. Like 30 years ago, it wasn't, you big bunch of dummies. For him, though, in particular, if you want to talk Elon Musk, he's selling electric vehicles, isn't he? So why would he want hydrogen, which could potentially be a competitor, to suddenly get a leg up? Obviously, you wouldn't want that if you're a business person.
Interesting. And how is this playing out politically? Where do all the parties stand on transitioning to hydrogen and making this such a big part of our climate strategy?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually, because now I'm out here in Alberta, and Alberta and the federal Liberal government don't necessarily always see eye to eye. I think it would be a fair statement. But hydrogen is one where they actually do seem to be getting along, because, again, Ottawa hasn't said we're only going to do green hydrogen and blue hydrogen can just, go get stuffed because we don't like it. It's not emissions less enough. And because Alberta sees hydrogen as a massive opportunity for the province, it is quite happy about the attention that is being placed on hydrogen. Hydrogen just has so many ways, so many opportunities for production across the country, that it does seem to be a kind of almost a place where everyone is seeing eye to eye. Almost like there's cooperation on a political level tomorrow, if you would believe it.
Amazing. I wonder if you could talk about what Canada's strategy on hydrogen looks like right now, and maybe just highlight how it could help the resource sector a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So the domestic hydrogen market, they hope it's going to be worth $50 billion by 2050, create about 350,000 jobs. And when you look at it, like, blue hydrogen is going to be the way that Canada is focusing in the short term, just because of the fact that the technology is already here. It's relatively affordable compared with the production of green hydrogen at this point. We have a ton of natural gas in Western Canada, so we can do it pretty easily. So Ottawa's kind of looking first off at blue hydrogen, but it's not picking one over the other necessarily. Sure, in the short term, blue is kind of where we're going to need to go just by virtue of the fact that's where technology is, that's where it's cheapest. But Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan, when I asked him about this back when they released the strategy, he said, I will not pick amongst my children, so he doesn't want to pick blue or green. There's already places, like I've told you, Alberta uses it. In BC, there's a massive hydrogen fuel cell producer called Ballard. It has something like 1,400 patents and annual revenues for more than $100 million US from sales of its fuel cell stacks that it's selling all around the world. The federal strategy in Canada looks at opportunities like that, and it has a bunch of opportunities that it identifies. So the idea is to create these regional kind of hubs. For example, a regional transportation hub or a power generation hub or an industrial hub. So stuff like out here in Alberta, we've got something called the Industrial Heartland, which I won't get into, but the idea is they're already dealing with hydrogen in a big way, so let's make that a hub. We look out west, look at the coastal ports in BC. That's a really great potential for a hydrogen hub if you're going to use it in shipping. And then similarly, head out the other side of the country, head out east, and you've got similar things out in the Atlantic region, maybe Quebec as well. And out here in Alberta, there's already a pilot project running where it's between Edmonton and Calgary. They've got hydrogen-powered trucks, like big trucks, running between the cities as a kind of pilot project to say, hey, is this actually doable? And all signs at this point do point to, yeah, this is potentially a thing that we can do on a larger scale.
And how does the federal strategy for hydrogen in Canada compare to other countries that have expressed interest in developing this sector?
The Canadian strategy is less about specific dollars and cents that they will put into it compared with like Germany, which is like, we're going to put this much right here. You know, they've committed actual dollars to it. In Australia as well, there's been actual real dollars committed to hydrogen because in Australia, of course, we have, so I am originally Australian, which is why I say we, but in Australia, of course, it's very sunny. You can try and use some solar in that way, but hydrogen is kind of a big deal down there. They have a big strategy. Different countries in Asia have strategies as well. Even more countries have included hydrogen in their kind of net zero goals or in different energy transition plans that they have. You know, they might not have something called a hydrogen strategy. They might have a transition goal and hydrogen will be part of that. So a lot of countries are eyeing this as a potential win for their countries. And that's why Canada wants to get in now. Now, it's going to have to pull its socks up and really get cracking pretty quickly here because there are so many other countries that are jumping on the hydrogen train, right? So you really need to get started and you need to do that quickly. Canada just doesn't have the time to mess about it. Like it really does need to get cracking.
Yeah. And what are the estimates of how big this market could be? Do we have a number?
Yes, we do. We have a couple of numbers. So in Alberta, we have a natural gas strategy out here. It's great reading. You should definitely flip through it on a Friday night.
Oh, definitely.
It reckons that we'll have a $3.5 trillion industry by 2050. Now, that's globally. That's a massive number, right? And then when you look at the federal strategy, it's kind of saying out of that $3.5 trillion industry, Ottawa hopes Canada can get a $50 billion, that's B, not T, $50 billion industry happening by 2050.
Yeah. So based on everything you're telling me, it sounds like there is reason to put a lot of hope in hydrogen. Based on your reporting, do you think hydrogen could save us? Is it the climate savior that it's hyped up to be?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. Will hydrogen be our savior? I mean, realistically, no, it won't, because it's going to take an awful lot of different things and different pieces to this whole puzzle of how we lower emissions. But I think in everything I've reported on and the people I've spoken with tend to look at hydrogen like it is going to be one of the key components in how we manage to hit net zero and how we manage to try and at least maybe keep that climate change from happening as quickly as it might otherwise do. So it's generally looked at as one of the key components, not by itself, because I don't think there's any silver bullet. And I think anyone who has reported on anything to do with energy transitions would tell you that there is one thing that will save us all. Mm-hmm. It's how they're all used together, right? And hydrogen does seem to be part of that for sure.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Emma Graney. You can find her on Twitter at Emma L. Graney.
Anytime you want to talk hydrogen, I'm your gal.
If you like this episode, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We're a new show, so it really helps. If you want to reach us, email us at thedecibel@theglobeandmail.com. You can also tweet me at anima_TK. And if you don't already, make sure you hit follow wherever you're listening to this so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.